Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In this episode, I'm sharing 9 true Christmas horror stories on Christmas Eve. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so YouTube shows you stories like this next time. Also, let us know from where you are watching and what time it is there. Matthew Collins first saw the figure standing in the middle of Ridge Road when the snow was falling heavy and fast, slanting in the wind like white knives cutting through the night. His truck's headlights carved narrow tunnels of visibility through the blizzard, and in that fleeting tunnel of light stood something so tall, so still, so unnaturally shaped that Matthew felt the breath lock in his chest. A thin, pale figure, unmoving, almost carved from ice, staring directly at him. For a split second, the sight seemed impossible, dreamlike, but the panic spreading through his chest was very real. He blinked, and the figure was still there until suddenly it wasn't. It didn't run, didn't step aside, didn't fade away. It simply vanished into the storm, as if the snow itself had swallowed it. Matthew's hands tightened around the steering wheel, and a sudden, unwanted memory ripped through him. The night his parents died on this same road. In a storm like this one, swerving to avoid something they claimed they saw standing in the snow. He had convinced himself they were hallucinating in the storm, but now he wasn't so sure. He pushed forward because he had a promise to keep. He was heading to his sister Lucy's cabin in Grey Pines, a rural stretch of northern Wisconsin where the winters were brutal and the forests swallowed sound. They hadn't spent Christmas together in 11 years, not since their parents' accident. Guilt lived in his bones, knowing how he had distanced himself from family, busying himself with work and excuses. This year, though, Lucy insisted he come home, and Matthew swore he would. The cabin was isolated, resting deep in a maze of pines and steep ridgelines, its windows glowing during the holidays like a beacon in the endless dark. He remembered summers fishing there, winters packing snow into forts, and the warmth of Christmas mornings with cocoa and flannel blankets. The nostalgia made him press harder on the gas, even as the storm thickened and visibility shrank. Ridge Road was the final stretch, a narrow, winding strip flanked by towering trees. Tonight, those trees looked like black pillars guarding secrets in the white fog. As he drove deeper, his phone buzzed with a text from Lucy asking if he was close. He typed back that he was 10 minutes away, but the message failed to send, leaving him with only the howling wind for company. He glanced at the rearview mirror, then again and again, without even meaning to. Each time, he felt a strange pressure behind him, as though something moved in the swirling blizzard just out of sight. His nerves prickled. Snow blurred everything, but faintly, so faintly he wondered if fatigue was tricking him. He saw tall shadows moving between the trees. At first he dismissed it as branches swaying. Then the shadow moved too smoothly, too deliberately. That was when he saw the figure again, standing dead center in the road, only several yards ahead. Same height, same gray, corpse-like skin, same stillness. Matthew jerked the wheel, swerving wildly. His truck spun, skidding across the ice before slamming into a heavy snowbank. The impact rattled his teeth. The engine sputtered once, twice, then went silent. Snow piled around the tires as if eager to bury him alive. Matthew's lungs tightened. He grabbed the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, afraid to look to his left, because he could feel something there. Something inches away behind the frosted glass. He heard it, a soft, deliberate tap on his window. Then again, tap, 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 a frozen knuckle hitting the glass. Slow, patient, like an invitation or a reminder. Matthew squeezed his eyes shut, breath shallow, resisting the urge to look. His heart hammered so violently he thought the creature could hear it. Finally, after several seconds of suffocating terror, the tapping stopped. He opened his eyes and scanned the mirrors. Nothing, no shape, no shadow, no disturbance in the snow. But his gut screamed that he wasn't alone. Not on this road. Not in this storm. Not tonight. He forced the door open and stumbled into the cold, gripping a flashlight from the back seat. The storm hit him like a fist. Snowflakes, sharp as glass, wind slicing through his jacket. He had to reach the cabin. Staying in the truck meant certain death, either from the cold or from that thing. Lucy's cabin was half a mile away. He began trudging, snow nearly knee-deep, the forest pressing close on both sides. Every few steps he heard footsteps behind him, snow crunching beneath weight, but when he turned, the storm erased everything. The footsteps resumed when he moved, stopping when he stopped, following, matching him, stalking him in the whirlwind of white. He sought it again, closer this time. The walker. That's what people in town whispered about, though they never said it loudly. Lucy once told him the locals believed the ridge had an old presence living in the woods, something that watched travelers during winter storms, appearing as a tall, skeletal figure. They said it followed families, sometimes for years. Matthew had never believed it. He thought it was a story made to spook kids or keep them from wandering too far. But his father had once whispered to him, "There's something on these roads, son. Something old. Something that remembers." Matthew never forgot the tone of his father's voice that night. A tone he only heard once, the night before the accident that killed both his parents. Snow blurred the world into white noise, but the walker's form remained distinct. Tall and thin, gliding instead of walking. When Matthew ran, it followed without effort, its long limbs barely moving as it crossed the distance. The cabin lights appeared through the trees like a small flame struggling in a storm. "Lucy," he shouted, though the wind swallowed the sound. He stumbled up the steps and pounded the door with raw desperation. Lucy flung it open, pulling him inside before he even finished crossing the threshold. The warmth shocked his frozen skin. Lucy's face turned ashen when she saw the terror in Matthew's eyes. "What happened?" she whispered. He tried to speak, but a violent thud shook the cabin wall. The lights flickered. The wood creaked like something heavy dragged itself around the exterior. Lucy grabbed a knife, Matthew a fire poker. They stood shoulder to shoulder as another thud rattled the house. Then the steady sound of finger-slung fingers scraping across the wooden siding. The storm howled outside, and the cabin seemed to shrink with every pass the creature made. Then everything went silent. Not a single gust of wind. Not a creak in the floorboards. The kind of silence that feels too complete to be natural. Lucy swallowed and whispered, "Is it gone?" Matthew didn't answer. He stepped slowly toward the frosted window. He wiped a circle with his sleeve. At first he saw only trees and swirling snow. Then the face appeared, pressed directly against the glass dot, grey skin stretched tight over bone, hollow, black eye sockets, and a mouth that curled into a grotesque, unnatural grin. Lucy screamed. The window shattered inward, and freezing air blasted through the cabin as two long, skeletal arms reached inside. The creature moved impossibly fast, forcing its way through the broken frame, stretching and contorting like its bones were made of ice instead of flesh. Lights flickered violently before dying completely, plunging the cabin into blackness. In the dark, Matthew heard Lucy gasp, heard furniture topple, heard the sound of nails dragging across the floor. He swung the fire poker blindly, connecting with nothing but cold air. Something grabbed his arm, ice-cold fingers squeezing until his bones ground together. A voice, if it could be called, that whispered in the dark, like snow sliding off a frozen roof. Then silence. Days later, once the storm lifted, rangers searched the area. They found Lucy's cabin buried deep in snow, the fireplace still warm, 2 mugs of cocoa still on the table, Christmas decorations glowing faintly as if nothing had happened. But Matthew and Lucy were gone. No footprints leading away, no blood, no signs of struggle other than the shattered window. Even the broken glass had frozen smooth, edges sealed by ice in a way the rangers couldn't explain. One ranger noticed something carved into the frosted pane of the remaining window. 5 words etched deeply, far too precisely to be made by a human hand. I never forget. Since then, every Christmas Eve, travelers on Ridge Road report seeing a tall figure standing in the storm, motionless, watching. Some say it appears closer each time they blink. Some say they hear tapping on their car windows when the snow falls just right. And some say that once the walker chooses a family, it never stops following, never stops waiting, never stops remembering. Every December, the small mountain town of Red Elk Valley became a postcard scene of Christmas. Perfection winkling lights wrapped around snow-draped cabins, pine wreaths hanging on frosted windows, smoke drifting from chimneys into air cold enough to sting the lungs. But for Daniel Hart, returning this Christmas felt different. He hadn't been home in 14 years. Not since the night his childhood friend Emma Hayes went missing in the woods behind their neighborhood during a Christmas night sleigh ride. Her disappearance had torn the town apart, fractured families, shattered traditions. Some claimed she ran away. Others believed she froze in the woods. Daniel remembered things differently, though he had never spoken of it. He remembered Emma screaming as something dragged her into the trees. He remembered the dark, towering shape. He remembered the bells, those faint, metallic jingles that echoed even after she vanished. No one believed him. Eventually he stopped telling the story at all. But the memory lived in him like frostbite. This year, after years of avoiding home, his sister insisted he return for Christmas. Their mother's health was failing, and Daniel couldn't refuse. So he drove up the mountain road, the same curved route lit only by the reflection of his headlights off the snow, trying not to look into the forest on either side. Night had fallen by the time he arrived. The house looked the same, warm yellow lights glowing through snow-covered windows, a wreath on the door, the smell of pine and cinnamon slipping into the cold air each time the door opened. His mother hugged him with shaking arms, thinner and weaker than he remembered. His sister Julia smiled warmly but carried the exhaustion of someone who had been caring for a dying parent far too long. They talked, ate, laughed softly. For a moment, Daniel let himself relax. But then he noticed the faint sound of jingling bells drifting from the woods outside. He froze at the window, staring into the darkness between the trees. There was nothing. No movement, no shape, just endless black forest swallowing the snow. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks. After all, 14 years had passed. Yet when he tried to sleep that night, the bells grew louder, not cheerful sleigh bells. Slow, uneven, dragging bells, metal scraping metal, clinking faintly in the wind. Daniel sat up in bed, breath chilling in his throat. He went to the window, pushing aside the curtain. Snow fell gently, the street empty, houses silent. But the tree line beyond the last cabin looked darker than night itself. As if something stood there, staring back. He stepped away. He didn't sleep again. The next morning was Christmas Eve, and the town gathered for their annual festival despite the rising storm warnings. Booths served hot chocolate. Carolers sang beneath strings of glowing lights. Children tossed snowballs near the giant Christmas tree, but everyone avoided looking toward the forest. Daniel noticed a change immediately. Red Elk Valley wasn't just older, it was afraid. While walking with Julia, he overheard whispers. Another disappearance. Just 2 nights ago, a teenage boy wandering too close to the woods. No footprints found. No signs of a struggle, just gone. Vanished the way Emma had. A cold ripple crawled across Daniel's spine. He wanted to ask more, but the townspeople lowered their voices or drifted away when he approached. Everyone remembered he was the last one to see Emma alive. Everyone remembered what he had claimed he saw. Everyone believed he had imagined it or worse, that he was hiding something. The festival continued, but the atmosphere was cracked. Fake smiles stretched over quiet dread. Even children played in smaller circles, glancing warily toward the woods. And then the bells sounded again, faint, metallic, coming from behind the tree line. Daniel locked eyes with an elderly man selling roasted chestnuts. The man froze mid-motion, his face draining of color. He whispered, "It's awake again." Before Daniel could ask him anything, Julia tugged his arm. "Daniel, look." A little girl stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark spaces between the pines. Her mother screamed her name and ran to her just as a tall, shadowy shape shifted behind the trees. A shape that shouldn't have been able to move so silently. The woods fell still. The bells stopped. The mother dragged the child away, sobbing. Daniel's legs nearly buckled. His heart pounded so fiercely it hurt. Julia whispered, "Was that?" Daniel couldn't answer, because he knew. He had seen it before. 14 years ago, on a snowy Christmas night, the storm hit earlier than expected, forcing everyone to return home before evening. Wind howled through the valley, snow swirling so thick it looked like white smoke rising from the ground. Power flickered across the neighborhood. Julia lit candles, while their mother slept in her recliner beneath a heavy quilt. The house creaked with every gust. Daniel paced, unable to shake the tightening dread in his chest. He kept hearing things in the storm cracks of branches, low groans, the faint dragging sound of something moving through snow. And then Julia gasped. At first, Daniel thought she had burned herself on a candle, but she was staring out the window facing the backyard and the forest beyond it. Daniel looked. His stomach twisted sickly. 20 yards from the house, just at the edge of the trees, stood a tall figure, thin, limb-like, arms dangling toward the ground. Skin color indistinguishable from the storm, blending into the white like a ghost half. But the bells were unmistakable, hanging from its neck, from its wrists, from antlers, yes, antlers rising from its skull. Not the antlers of a living deer, but blackened, decayed, twisting unnaturally like branches of a dead tree. The creature stood completely motionless, head tilted slightly, as if listening, as if remembering, as if choosing. Julia whispered, "Daniel, what is that?" He swallowed hard. "It took Emma. I saw it. I thought I imagined it. But I didn't." Julia backed away from the window, eyes wide, breathing sharp and fast. "We need to lock the doors." They checked every window, every latch, every door frame. But deep down, Daniel knew locks wouldn't matter. The creature didn't need doors. The storm grew violent, wind roaring so fiercely the walls trembled. Snow climbed high against the sides of the house. Lights flickered one final time, then died. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the dim candle glow. Julia lit more candles with shaking hands. "What does it want?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer, because suddenly the bells began again, close, too close. The front porch creaked. Something stepped onto it. Heavy, deliberate, slow. Daniel grabbed the fireplace poker, hands slick with sweat. Julia held a kitchen knife, breath trembling. The creature's shadow passed by the front window, its silhouette enormous, skeletal, monstrous. It paused, head turning toward the glass. The bells jingled softly, almost gently, as if scenting the air. Then it moved again. A faint tapping came from the back door, then the side door, then the living room window, then the kitchen window. The creature was circling the house, tapping each surface lightly, almost curiously, as if searching for the weakest point. Snow slammed against the walls like fists. Julia whispered frantically, "Mum, what about Mum?" Daniel ran to the recliner. Their mother lay motionless, blankets rising and falling with shallow breaths. He touched her face, cold, too cold. Her eyes fluttered open. "Danny," she rasped weakly. "What's happening?" He forced a calmness he didn't feel. "Just a storm, Mum." But she shook her head slowly. "No, I heard the bells." Her voice cracked. "It came when I was a girl too." Daniel froze. Julia looked at him, horror filling her eyes. "What?" Their mother's voice was barely a whisper. "It takes one child, every generation." The room spun around Daniel. The tapping at the windows grew louder, more impatient. The creature circled faster now, bells clanging softly with each step. The house groaned, then everything went silent. Daniel held his breath. Julia clutched their mother's hand. Frost crept slowly across the inside of the living room window, thin, swirling patterns forming the shape of antlers. The wind stopped. The tapping stopped. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Daniel moved quietly to the window, heart thundering. He wiped a small circle in the frost. The creature's face filled the glass. Hollow eyes. Skin stretched too tightly over bones. A jaw that hung open far too wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. A crown of rotted antlers rising like twisted roots. It stared directly at him, breath fogging the glass from the outside despite the sub-zero temperature. Its lips curled into something like a smile. A string of rusted bells hung from its neck, each one swaying in a breathless, impossible wind. Julia screamed. Daniel stumbled back. The creature's hand pressed against the window. Long, thin fingers with nails like curved black knives. The glass cracked spiderwebs beneath its touch. The house trembled. Snow blew violently against the walls. The creature pressed harder. The window splintered. Daniel grabbed Julia's arm. Basement, now. She pulled their mother's wheelchair as fast as she could. The creature punched through the window. Shards sprang across the room. The bells roared as the creature climbed inside, its limbs contorting to fit through the frame. Its hands scraped the floorboards. Its breath hissed through the dark. Daniel swung the poker, hitting its arm with a dull crack. The creature barely reacted. It turned its hollow gaze toward him, as if amused. They fled down the basement stairs, slamming the door behind them. Julia wedged a heavy wooden dresser against it. Their mother wheezed softly, whispering prayers under her breath. Snow had been falling over northern Vermont for 3 days straight when Emily Carver returned to her childhood home for Christmas, a place she hadn't visited since her mother died 5 years earlier. And as her car crawled up the long forest road leading to the small cabin at the edge of Pine Hollow, she felt an uncomfortable tightening in her chest. Not grief exactly, but something she couldn't name. As though the winter woods themselves were watching her arrival with unblinking, patient eyes. The cabin looked the same frost-bitten roof, old wooden porch, dim yellow Christmas lights her mother had always kept up even after the holidays. But something about the front of the house was different. Something she noticed the moment she stepped out into the freezing air. There was a window where a window had never been before. A tall, narrow, vertical window next to the front door, framed in old pine wood, faintly fogged on the inside. And behind that fog, she thought she saw the shape of someone standing there, still and dark and close, watching her, though when she blinked, the shape was gone, leaving only pale distortion against the glass. She told herself she must be remembering the house. Wrong 5 years was a long time, but the unease didn't leave her as she carried her bags inside, and the smell of cold wood and old dust greeted her like a memory she wished she'd forgotten. And though everything else in the cabin was exactly as she remembered, including the decorated Christmas tree her mother used to assemble weeks early, the new window bothered her in a way she couldn't shake. Because the cabin had only ever had 3 windows, one in the kitchen, one in the living room behind the couch, and one in the small hallway near the bedrooms, but never, not once, had there been a tall, narrow window near the door. Her mother had always said she didn't like front-facing glass because it felt like inviting strangers to look right into your life. Sitting on the couch that evening, exhaustion weighing heavy on her, Emily felt the cold creeping from that new window, as if its frame leaked winter directly into the living room. And when she drew closer to examine it, she noticed fingerprints on the inside of the glass. Long, slender prints slightly too long to be human, smudging downward as though someone had dragged their hand slowly along the surface before stepping away. She wiped the glass clean, convincing herself it must have been from the movers when the house was cleared years ago, though she didn't remember anyone cleaning or renovating after her mother's death. Her mother had lived alone, quiet and private, and no one had touched the cabin since the funeral. But as the evening deepened and the storm outside intensified, she kept glancing toward that glass, half expecting a face to press up against it from the outside. By midnight, with the wind howling against the roof and the chimney groaning like something alive, Emily decided to sleep in her old bedroom. though the thought of the hallway window also fogged despite the heater running made her shiver. And as she turned out the living room lights, she froze, because the new window by the door glowed faintly from inside, as if a thin white light was spreading behind the glass, illuminating soft movement behind it, something shifting back and forth, scraping lightly, like fingernails brushing wood. She forced herself not to look again, hurried into her bedroom, shut the door, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily, because every few minutes she heard something in the hallway. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, heel to toe, like someone pacing from the kitchen to her bedroom door and back again. And once she sat up, holding her breath, certain she heard breathing on the other side of the wall deep. Controlled breathing not belonging to her yet when she mustered the courage to crack her bedroom door open. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the faint glow of Christmas lights she had forgotten to unplug. The next morning, the storm still raged. The frost on the windows had thickened into crystallized patterns that looked like skeletal hands spreading across the glass. And when she walked past the new front window, she noticed something that made her stop cold. There were footprints in the snow outside, leading up to the front of the house, single file, bare footprints, long and thin. With unnaturally pointed toes, and they stopped directly in front of the new window, facing inward, as if someone had been standing there for hours, watching her sleep. The prints were fresh, despite the ongoing storm, which should have erased them quickly, and Emily's heart thudded painfully as she followed them with her eyes. Realizing they didn't lead back into the forest, they began at the window, not from the woods, as though the figure who made them hadn't walked there but had stepped out of the house. She backed away, pulse hammering, and decided she would leave as soon as the snow let up. But until then she would keep every door locked and try not to look at that impossible window. While making coffee, she remembered a box of her mother's things stored in the attic, old journals, photos, scraps of her mother's strange beliefs, the ones Emily always brushed off as rural superstition. And digging through it, she found a leather-bound notebook labeled Winter Watcher, which her mother had never mentioned before. Flipping through the pages, she read frantic entries describing a figure her mother claimed had followed their family for generations, appearing only during midwinter storms, always seen through windows, always watching but never speaking. And her mother wrote repeated warnings: do not acknowledge it, do not look too long, do not let it see you seeing it, and it can only enter through windows new, windows you didn't build. The blood drained from Emily's face as she reread the last line. Her mother ever wrote in the journal, if you ever see a window that was not there before, it means it has already chosen you. Panic surged through Emily as she heard a soft tapping from the other room, rhythmic and slow, and when she walked toward the sound, her breath frosting in the cold air, she saw a shadow behind the tall, narrow window, too tall, stretching from top to bottom like the silhouette of someone whose limbs were slightly too long for a human body, and its hand, pale against the fogged glass, tapped gently, as if trying to get her attention, each tap vibrating through the wooden floor beneath her feet. She stumbled backward, nearly falling, and ducked into the kitchen, heart pounding so loud she thought the thing might hear it. But when she dared peek from behind the wall, the shadow was gone, leaving only long streaks on the inside of the glass again, though she hadn't gone near it since cleaning it the night before. The storm grew even worse by afternoon, winds screaming around the cabin, bending trees so violently she feared they might snap, and as the sky darkened prematurely, she felt the cabin grow colder, unnaturally cold, the kind that seeped into her bones And she knew, without understanding, how that it was inside the house now. Every window began to fog. Every surface collected frost, even though the heater was running. And the air felt heavy, thick with presence, like someone breathing down her neck from just behind her. She called the police, but the storm interfered with reception, her phone cutting in and out, the dispatcher's voice fading until she heard nothing but static. And underneath that static, she swore she heard a whisper, low and stretched, saying her name, M. I lie, dragging each syllable as though tasting it. She dropped the phone, shaking uncontrollably, and rushed to the front door, but when she tried to unlock it, the lock wouldn't turn. It was frozen solid from the inside, crystallized over as though something had touched it with an icy hand. She grabbed her coat, grabbed the journal, and raced to the back door instead, but it too was frozen. The doorknob covered in a thin layer of frost that formed a perfect handprint, long-fingered and unmistakably inhuman. She backed away, swearing, tears burning her eyes from terror. And then she heard it. Footsteps coming down the hallway, slow but uneven, like whoever or whatever was moving didn't fully understand how to walk, each step stretching slightly too long, as if its limbs were adjusting to mimic human movement. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the air grew colder with each step. And Emily ducked into her mother's old room, pushing the door shut silently, pressing her ear to it, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside, and she smelled it through the crack beneath the door of freezing. Earthy smell, like wet soil mixed with old pine bark, the smell of something that had never belonged indoors. She clutched her mother's journal to her chest, flipping to the last pages, reading the final entry written in shaky handwriting that barely held form. If it enters, don't run, don't scream, do not show fear. It feeds on fear, and if you look at it directly, you will become its window, its way in, its way out. And the words made no sense until she heard soft scratching on the bedroom wall, tracing upward, then downward, then circling, as though drawing shapes she couldn't see. Eventually, the scratching stopped, replaced by a faint creaking, and when she dared glance around the room, her stomach dropped violently. Another window had appeared on the wall across from her, a small square window, fogged over from inside, and behind it she saw the suggestion of a face, stretched and wrong, pressed almost lovingly against the glass, watching her with glazed white eyes, smiling with a mouth that opened too wide. She screamed despite the warnings, the sound ripping out of her uncontrollably, and the figure inside the window began pushing at the glass. The road to Black Pines Lodge wound through 30 miles of dense winter forest, and by the time Daniel Hale finally reached the reception cabin on Christmas Eve, the storm had turned vicious, filling the night with white-out winds that seemed to whisper against the windshield in long, human-like breaths, the kind that made him grip the wheel a little tighter. He had booked Cabin 7 for a solitary holiday retreat, hoping to escape the crushing grief of his recent breakup and the suffocating expectations of his family. And though the lodge was supposed to be a peaceful winter getaway, something about the place felt wrong the moment he parked. Maybe it was the lack of lights in the surrounding cabins, or the distant shapes that looked like people standing between the trees but vanished when he blinked, or the fact that the receptionist seemed too relieved, almost desperate, to see another guest. The woman at the desk, Mrs. Kincaid, handed him the key with hands that trembled slightly, cautioning him to stay inside after dark, no matter what, and to ignore any sounds outside the cabin because the wind in black pines plays tricks. But her voice cracked in a way that made Daniel wonder if she was hiding more than weather-related warnings. He brushed it off as rural superstition, thanked her, and trudged through the deepening snow to cabin 7, which sat farther from the main lodge than the others, half hidden by towering evergreens that groaned under the storm's weight. The cabin itself was small but cozy, a stone fireplace, creaky timber floors, a bed covered in plaid blankets, and a big window facing the dark forest where snow drifted in heavy, swirling sheets. But something in the silence unsettled him, a kind of pressure in the air that made him feel watched even with the curtains closed. After settling in, he lit the fireplace, made himself cocoa, and sat near the window reading an old mystery novel he found on the shelf, trying to shake off the lingering tension of the day's travel. But around 11:30 p.m., just as he reached for his mug, the landline phone in the cabin rang, shrill and sudden in the quiet, making his heart jump. He hesitated before answering, wondering what kind of lodge would even keep an old corded phone anymore, and when he finally picked it up, he said hello into the static-filled line, only to hear his own name whispered back at him, Daniel, in a voice that sounded like it was being pushed through snow, faint, distorted, and wrong, followed by a slow scraping sound that went on and on, as if someone were dragging something sharp across the receiver. He hung up immediately, pulse racing, telling himself it had to be a crossed line. Interference from the storm, anything rational. But as he sat in the silence afterward, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been trying to get his attention. An hour later, just past midnight, the phone rang again, cutting through the cabin like a blade, and though his instincts screamed not to answer, some deeper, colder part of him needed to know. So he lifted the receiver with a shaking hand. This time the voice was clearer. A low, breathy whisper saying, "Look outside," and before he could react, the line went dead, leaving him frozen in place. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he stepped toward the window and parted the curtains just an inch, only to jerk back violently. The snow outside was unbroken except for a single set of footprints, leading straight toward his cabin, deep and precise, as though someone had walked right up to the window moments before. And yet the snow continued falling thickly, meaning those prints should have already begun filling in, but they hadn't at all. Panic prickled up his spine, and Daniel dropped the curtain, grabbed a fireplace poker, and backed away from the window, listening for any sign of movement outside. But the storm howled so loud he couldn't distinguish wind from footsteps. He debated contacting the front desk, but his phone had no signal, and the landline suddenly looked like a threat rather than help. So he locked the doors, shoved a chair beneath the front knob, and sat awake by the fire until exhaustion eventually forced his eyes closed. He didn't know how long he slept, but he woke to a soft tapping at the window, delicate but deliberate, like fingernails clicking rhythmically against the glass, and for a full minute he lay stiff in bed, barely breathing, praying it was a branch blown by the wind. But the taps came again, evenly spaced, too controlled to be nature, summoning what little courage he had. He crept out of bed, holding the poker tight, and moved slowly toward the window as the tapping grew louder, quicker, almost impatient. But when he yanked the curtains open, no one was there, only snow, wind, and shadows shifting among the trees. The tapping stopped instantly, replaced by the sharp crack of the cabin's phone ringing yet again, jolting him so hard he nearly fell. Trembling, he lifted the receiver, and this time there was no whisper. No static, only the sound of someone breathing on the other end. Long, heavy breaths like someone who had been running, followed by a soft chuckle that froze his veins. He slammed the phone down, but it immediately rang again and again and again, each ring overlapping the last. The sound impossibly continuous, as if the phone weren't cycling through calls, but being held open by something that didn't care about human rules. Finally, he ripped the cord from the wall, silencing it, and the moment he did, the front door rattled violently, as though someone were trying the handle, testing it slowly, twisting it back and forth with controlled force. Daniel staggered backward, heart pounding, and the chair he'd shoved beneath the knob creaked under pressure, the wood groaning as though ready to snap. But after 10 unbearable seconds, the twisting stopped, replaced by soft footsteps in the snow outside, circling the cabin once, twice, 3 times, slow and methodical. He didn't sleep the rest of the night, staring at the front door until dawn finally broke, and when daylight came, he dared look outside again. There, in the snow, were footprints circling the cabin in a wide ring, deep and perfect, with long drag marks behind them as though the walker dragged something heavy. He wanted to leave immediately, but the storm had buried the roads, and the lodge staff hadn't ploughed yet, so he walked through the snow to the reception cabin, desperate for answers. Inside, Mrs. Kincaid looked at him with tired, knowing eyes, as though she'd been expecting him, and when he described the calls, the tapping, the footprints, she didn't seem surprised. In fact, she seemed frightened. She told him quietly that Black Pines Lodge had an old legend, one tied to Cabin 7 specifically, about a man named Jacob Thorne, a guest who had gone missing 26 years earlier during a Christmas storm just like this one. A man whose last known communication was a phone call to the front desk, repeating a phrase no one understood. "He's calling for me." And when staff reached his cabin the next morning, it was empty, the door still locked from inside. But footprints circled the cabin the same way Daniel had described. Worse, Mrs. Kincaid said that over the years, guests in Cabin 7 had reported strange phone calls from voices that weren't there, taps on window glass even in empty cabins, and the sound of someone walking slowly round the building late at night. Some guests fled before morning, while others left in such panicked hysterics they refused to talk about what they'd seen. She insisted on moving Daniel to a different cabin immediately, but when they searched for an available one, they discovered every other cabin had been rented weeks ago. Cabin 7 was the only one free because none of the locals ever booked it hand, as the snow continued to trap them all on lodge grounds. Daniel had no choice but to return to that cursed cabin until the storm lifted. He tried to move his things quickly, but back inside, the air already felt wrong, charged with a heavy, oppressive presence that pressed on his mind like invisible fingers. The landline phone, still unplugged, sat dead and silent on the nightstand, but as twilight settled and the wind began picking up again, Daniel swore he heard a faint ringing coming from it, not in the air but inside his mind, a phantom echoing tone that grew louder the more he ignored it. He busied himself packing, stoking the fire, playing music on his phone, even humming to break the silence. But as night settled like a thick blanket over the forest, the temperature inside the cabin dropped abruptly, as though the fire had been replaced by ice, and Daniel saw his own breath in the air. He pulled blankets round himself, sat on the bed and tried to focus, but then, without warning, the phone lit up, Pit's disconnected cord, dangling uselessly, yet its indicator bulb glowed a faint, sickly yellow, and the receiver lifted itself an inch off the cradle before falling back with a soft click. Daniel's blood ran cold, and he whispered, "Please stop," his voice cracking into the cold air. But as if responding to him, the phone lifted again, this time rising several inches before slamming down violently enough to crack the plastic. Then, slowly, mechanically, it rose once more and hung in the air, floating, the receiver hovering as if held to an invisible ear, and then it spoke. In that same icy whisper he'd heard the first night. "Daniel, are you there?" Followed by that same scraping sound, agonizingly slow, like someone dragging a fingernail along the length of the receiver. Daniel stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the phone dropped suddenly, shattering on the floor like brittle glass, but the whisper continued, now coming not from the phone but from the windows, from the door, from the walls themselves. The wind had already swallowed most of the mountain by the time Kyle Mercer arrived for his Christmas Eve shift at Hollow Creek Ranger Station, a lonely wooden outpost tucked deep in the Rockies where the nearest town was 48 miles away and the forest stretched unbroken in every direction. A silent, snow-covered world that felt abandoned by everything except the cold. He had volunteered for the shift because he had nowhere else to go this Christmas, no family gatherings, no warm living room waiting for him, and the idea of spending the night in a quiet station with nothing but snowfall and radio chatter seemed better than sitting in his apartment alone. But the moment he stepped out of his truck, something felt wrong, a heavy stillness in the air, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, watching him. The station lights flickered like tired eyes opening and closing, and the snow crunched beneath his boots in a strange rhythm to delayed, as if something else stepped after him a fraction of a second later. Inside, the place smelled of old coffee, dried pine, and the metallic sting of winter air leaking through the windows. And Kyle flicked on the overhead lights, noticing immediately that the main radio console was already on, static hissing faintly even though the last ranger had clocked out hours earlier. He chalked it up to bad equipment, hung his coat by the door, brewed coffee, and scanned through the shift log, which mentioned unusual reports from northern trailheads and possible unauthorized campers. Something that would normally mean nothing except the notes had been scribbled faster than usual. The handwriting hurried and uneven, as though whoever wrote them was distracted or scared. He sighed, took his mug to the observation window, and stared into the vast, snow-drenched darkness where the wind bent the trees and the forest moved like a breathing thing. And for the first couple of hours, the shift felt routine enough. Just Kyle, alone with paperwork, the crackle of the radio, and the occasional gust of snow hurling itself at the window. But everything changed around 10:42 p.m. when the radio snapped alive with sudden clarity and a man's voice came through, trembling, breathless, nearly drowned out by wind. "Any ranger. Anyone, please. I'm at the Hollow Creek Trail Loop. I think something's out here," followed by a crash, a gasp, and a line cutting into static. Kyle froze mid-sip, coffee burning his tongue as he swallowed too quickly, and he grabbed the receiver, answering, asking the caller to repeat his location. But the radio only responded with heavy breathing, almost animal-like, a deep rasp that didn't sound like wind or a human. Then the line cut completely. He tried dispatching, tried calling neighboring posts, but the storm had knocked out most channels, leaving only emergency frequency open, and even that was glitching. Kyle's pulse quickened as he pulled on his jacket again, grabbed his flashlight, emergency pack, flare gun, and snowshoes, and stepped back outside into the vicious night, where the cold slapped him so hard his throat seized, and for a moment he wondered if he should call for backup anyway. But he was the only ranger anywhere near this area tonight, and if someone was out there freezing or injured, every second mattered. The trek toward the Hollow Creek Loop took him through a narrow path of towering pine trees that groaned under the weight of the storm, their branches bending like skeletal arms, and the deeper he walked, the quieter the forest became. Not peaceful quiet, but suffocating quiet, the kind that feels staged, wrong, like everything is hiding. After 20 minutes, his flashlight flickered across fresh footprints, large boot treads, spaced unevenly as though the person was running, stumbling, and Kyle followed them, calling out occasionally, but the wind swallowed his voice. Then he found something half buried in snow, a glove torn at the fingertips, threads frozen with what looked like blood, tiny crimson crystals in the ice. He crouched, heart pounding, when he heard it, a faint ringing sound, impossible for the middle of the forest, tinny and distant, like an old telephone ringing from somewhere between the trees. Kyle straightened slowly, scanning the darkness, but the sound came again, clearer this time. Unmistakable, a phone ringing over and over, a sound so out of place that it made his stomach drop, because there were no phones out here, no cabins, no lines, nothing but endless snow and forest. He followed the noise, even though every instinct screamed not to, and after 100 feet he found the source, a backpack half buried in snow, the fabric slashed open, and inside it, shockingly intact, a cell phone glowing dimly as it rang with the name Mum flashing across the cracked screen. Kyle answered immediately, but instead of a panicked mother, he heard whispering, soft, rapid, unintelligible whispers layered over each other like a dozen voices speaking at once, and beneath them, something breathing wetly. Too close, too heavy, too slow. Kyle hung up, chest tight, adrenaline burning through him. And that was when he realized the forest was no longer silent in the distance. Something moved, the crunch of snow heavy, deliberate, slow, each step spaced too far apart to be human. Kyle turned off the phone, stuffed it into his coat, and followed the footprints again, moving faster now, checking over his shoulder every few seconds, because the footsteps behind him were growing louder, gaining. Eventually, the trail opened into a clearing, and his light fell onto a man huddled near a dead tree. One arm clutched against his chest, face pale, lips blue, eyes wide with terror. Kyle rushed to him, asking what happened, but the man only choked out, "It took him. It took my brother," pointing with a trembling hand toward the tree line where the darkness seemed impossibly thick. Kyle asked what it was, but the man only sobbed harder, shaking his head, whispering, "Don't let it call again. Don't answer when it calls." And before Kyle could ask anything else, a deep, vibrating hum rippled through the clearing, freezing both of them still. Then the trees began to move, not from wind, but from something large weaving between them, something with weight, something that made the ground faintly tremble. Kyle lifted his flashlight, and there, maybe 30 yards into the woods, stood a shape tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely visible against the snow, with limbs too long, too thin. bending at angles that made Kyle's vision reel as though his mind rejected what he saw. Its head was lowered, as if sniffing the air, and when it lifted slowly, Kyle's flashlight reflected off eyes that weren't eyes but gaping hollow pits, glowing faintly white, like snow packed into empty skull sockets. Then came another sound, ringing loud and crisp, echoing from the trees. Dozens of rings overlapping as if every tree had a phone hidden inside it. A nightmarish symphony of calls bouncing off the clearing. The creature tilted its head as though listening, its limbs stretching, cracking like ice breaking on a frozen lake. And Kyle knew instantly that this was what had been calling through the radio, through the phone, through the forest itself. He grabbed the injured man, urging him to move, but the man refused, sobbing that running wouldn't help, that the creature followed sound, followed names, followed the ones who answered, and that his brother had been taken after answering his phone from an unknown number. Before Kyle could convince him otherwise, a deafening snap erupted from the woods, and the creature lunged into the clearing with horrifying speed, faster than anything that large should move, its limbs unfolding like spider legs covered in frost. Kyle fired a flare gun into the air, the red light illuminating the clearing, and in that terrifying flash, he saw the creature's true form, a towering, skeletal frame draped in something that resembled tattered, frozen hide, its mouth a jagged split from ear to ear, filled with icicle-like teeth that dripped with melting snow, and its breath came in low, thunderous growls that vibrated the air. Kyle pulled the injured man to his feet, and together they stumbled back into the forest. But the creature followed effortlessly, its elongated arms dragging across the snow, leaving deep gouges that hissed with steam. Kyle shouted into his radio for any nearby unit, but only static answered him, static that slowly shaped itself into words, into a voice whispering Kyle, "Stop running." Kyle hurled the radio into the trees, but the voice continued from the wind itself, calling him, repeating his name with unbearable sweetness, like a mother calling a child home. The injured man screamed suddenly as something yanked him backward. One moment he was beside Kyle. The next he was being dragged across the snow, leaving a long, broken trail of red. Kyle spun, raised his flashlight, but all he saw was the man disappearing into darkness. His screams cut short in an instant as though swallowed. Shaking, barely breathing, Kyle forced his frozen legs to run, darting between trees, slipping on hidden ice, gasping clouds of pain into the air. But the creature's steps followed slow when he stopped, fast when he ran, like it was toying with him, herding him. Then it rang again. His pocket vibrated hard, and to his horror, the dead cell phone he'd taken from the backpack lit up brightly, ringing louder than before, the screen flashing with an unknown number. Kyle begged himself not to answer, not to even look, but the sound grew so loud, so piercing, that it felt like the entire forest was ringing, shaking, demanding. Finally, in a moment of panic and desperation, he threw the phone into the snow. But before it even landed, the creature appeared behind it. The blizzard had been crawling across North Dakota since morning, swallowing entire miles of farmland beneath a thick curtain of white. But for 34-year-old Brandon Keller, the storm was nothing new. He had driven through worse in his decade of hauling long-distance freight. What unsettled him tonight was not the cold, not the dark, not even the emptiness of the highway that usually stayed active with holiday travelers. It was the silence on the radio. All channels, even emergency frequencies, had gone dead 3 hours ago. Right after he passed the abandoned Sinclair station near the Montana line. He tried not to think about it. Tried to focus on his scheduled delivery to a remote Christmas tree farm in the outskirts of Williston. The owner, an elderly man named Warren Briggs, had ordered specialized wooden crates for shipping rare blue spruce saplings, and the delivery was due before Christmas Eve morning. Brandon planned to drop it off, sign the papers, then head back south before the storm worsened. But as midnight approached, his nerves began to crack. The snowstorm had grown unnaturally strong, as if the world outside the windshield was being erased. His headlights illuminated nothing but white turbulence, and the GPS flickered for the 10th time that hour, its signal struggling to triangulate through the thick clouds. The truck heater struggled too, coughing out lukewarm gusts no matter how high he turned the dial. The temperature was dropping fast, far faster than the storm should allow, and Brandon felt a strange, creeping sensation that the cold itself was alive. He clenched the steering wheel, forcing himself to stay calm, but a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from the back of the trailer, soft at first, then louder. It sounded like knuckles on wood. He winced and glanced at the rearview mirror, though he knew he would see nothing but the dark cargo hold and swirling snow. The crates were tied down, secure. They couldn't be moving. At least, they shouldn't be. The tapping continued. Brandon swallowed hard, turned up the radio again, and got static. Then for a split second he heard something buried beneath the white noise. A soft whisper. A breath. Turn. Around, he froze, hand hovering over the dial. The whisper crackled again, this time sharper, angrier. Turn around. The radio died completely, power draining out as if ripped from the wires. Brandon's pulse surged. Was someone playing a prank? Was he hallucinating after too many hours on the road? He forced himself to laugh, but it came out thin, brittle. He tightened his grip on the wheel and kept driving until the GPS suddenly blinked back to life. A single line appeared on the screen. Stop, now. Brandon slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly before coming to a halt in the storm. He stared at the GPS, heart hammering against his ribs. That message wasn't part of any navigation system. Then the tapping from the back of the trailer became violent. Frantic fists slamming against wood in rapid bursts, as if something inside the crates was desperately trying to get out. Brandon lunged out of the driver's seat and stumbled into the freezing night, clutching his flashlight. The wind howled through the dark plains, drowning out his breathing, but the pounding from the trailer was unmistakable. He hurried to the rear doors and yelled, "Who's in there?" No answer, only rapid thuds. He swung open the doors, saw the crates shaking. Each one was strapped down, yet they jerked like something alive was thrashing inside. The wood bulged outward, splintered, groaned under invisible weight. A terrible cold seeped from the crate, a cold that cut deeper than the storm. Brandon stepped back, terrified, when suddenly the motion stopped. Everything fell dead silent. He moved his flashlight beam across the cargo space, and that's when he saw it. Frost spreading across the crates in thin, branching patterns like veins. It was growing, crawling outward, racing toward the open doors. Brandon slammed the doors shut and bolted back to the cab, hands shaking violently. He climbed inside, locked the doors, and tried to start the truck, but the ignition clicked uselessly. The engine was dead. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Frost crept along the windows. Brandon exhaled and saw his breath turn to ice crystals in mid-air. Something scraped along the outside of the truck, slow, deliberate, like fingers dragging across metal. Then a deep voice, colder than the wind, murmured from the darkness, "You shouldn't have come." Brandon felt tears sting his eyes as he pressed back into his seat. He tried calling for help, but his phone displayed no service. The scraping continued until it reached the driver's side door. And then everything went quiet again. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Finally, the GPS screen flickered one last time and displayed a new message. He was supposed to receive them before midnight. You failed. Now they will take you instead. Brandon felt the blood drain from his face. What does that mean? He whispered. The answer came in the form of a bang-an explosive blow to the side of the truck that nearly knocked it off its wheels. Brandon screamed and curled into himself as another hit rocked the trailer. Then another, until the entire vehicle shook violently. The metal groaned and bent inward. Something massive was outside. Something strong. Something angry. A shadow moved past the windshield, tall and towering, far taller than any person. The silhouette blurred through the snow, pacing back and forth. Brandon forced himself to look out the window again, and through the frost-glazed glass, he saw two glowing blue eyes staring directly at him. They were inhumanly bright, burning like frozen flames. He gasped and slid down into the footwell, hiding. The creature let out a guttural growl that vibrated the entire truck. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. Brandon grabbed the steering wheel and braced himself. But before the handle could lift fully, something else happened. Distant chime echoed through the storm. Soft at first, then louder. Bells, Christmas bells. The creature paused. The bells grew closer, and then Brandon realized it wasn't just bells. It was singing. Children singing. Their voices drifted through the blizzard like a choir. The creature snarled, then vanished into the storm. Brandon waited several minutes before gathering the courage to look outside. The highway was empty. The singing faded. The bells faded. The storm grew eerily calm. Terrified but desperate, Brandon ran from the truck into the snow, heading toward the only visible landmarker, dim light flickering in the distance. As he approached, he realized it was a cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. He pounded on the door, sobbing, "Please, let me in." The door opened, and an old man stood there, holding a lantern. His eyes widened. "You weren't supposed to come," he whispered. Brandon stumbled back. "Warren Briggs." The old man nodded slowly. "They told me someone else was coming. They told me he would deliver them before midnight." His gaze drifted past Brandon toward the highway. "You didn't make it in time." Brandon shook violently. "What's inside those crates?" The old man's face twisted with grief. "The winter spirits. They were supposed to be contained, sent back north before they woke." He looked at the storm behind Brandon. "But now they're loose." Brandon's breath caught. A distant roar echoed across the plains. The old man grabbed Brandon's arm and ushered him inside the cabin, bolting the door. "If they mark you," he whispered, "they never stop hunting." Brandon's blood ran cold. "Marked." Warren nodded. "Did you see the eyes?" Brandon couldn't speak. The old man slowly exhaled. "Then it's too late." Another roar shook the cabin walls. "They'll take back what was promised." Brandon sank to the floor, covering his ears as the howling outside intensified. Snow hammered the windows with unnatural force. Warren whispered a prayer. The lights flickered. The cabin door groaned as something pushed against it slowly, deliberately. Warren shouted, "They want you, not me. You delivered them late, not I." Brandon crawled backward, sobbing. The door splintered. A freezing gust of wind exploded into the cabin, and then those blue eyes filled the doorway. Brandon screamed, but the storm swallowed his voice whole. When the snow finally cleared 3 days later, state troopers found the cabin empty. No bodies, no footprints. No sign anyone had been there at all. Only Brandon's truck remained on the road, frost-covered and abandoned, the trailer doors hanging open and the crates inside shattered from within. The night before Christmas, in the remote Colorado town of Pine Hollow, was always quiet, so quiet that even the snowfall seemed to muffle itself out of respect for the forested valley and the old cabins tucked between frozen pines. But this year, the silence carried something heavy beneath it, something that made 29-year-old Sophia Harrington grip her steering wheel tighter as she drove along the winding mountain road leading to her aunt's cabin. She hadn't visited Pine Hollow in nearly 10 years, not since her older brother Luke vanished during a Christmas Eve snowstorm when they were kids. Luke had been 13, she had been 9, and no one ever found a body. The sheriff claimed he had wandered off during a game of hide-and-seek and probably fell into the ravine. But Sophia never believed it. She remembered the way he screamed. She remembered hearing it from the cabin porch just before he disappeared into the storm. She remembered hearing a voice that did not belong to her brother calling her name from the woods. For years, she tried to convince herself she had misheard, but the holidays always brought nightmares, visions of Luke's pale face staring at her through snow-covered branches, whispering warnings she couldn't understand. Tonight, she felt the same unease creeping up her spine as the snowstorm thickened. Her Aunt Margaret had begged her to come spend Christmas Eve with her so she wouldn't be alone. "The storm's coming in heavy," she had said, "and your mother would have wanted you here." That was enough for Sophia. Now, as she pulled up the final bend in the road, she saw the warm glow of the cabin lights flickering through the trees. Relief washed through her. She parked, grabbed her bags, and hurried through the snow to the porch. But before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing her aunt's pale, strained face. "Sophia, thank God," Margaret breathed, pulling her into a tight hug. "You made it before dark." Sophia frowned gently. "I texted you. I said I'd be here by 7. Margaret shook her head, trembling. "I didn't get any texts, and the power keeps flickering. Something's wrong with the lines again." She ushered Sophia inside, locking the door behind them. The cabin was warm, cozy, decorated with old-fashioned Christmas lights and garlands, just like when Sophia was a child. But something about the room felt different, more tense, more watched. Margaret made tea, but her hands shook as she poured. "You're worried about the storm?" Sophia asked. Her aunt exhaled shakily. "No. I'm worried about what comes with it." Sophia stiffened. "Aunt Margaret, what do you mean?" The older woman hesitated, then whispered, "There's been sightings again." The words hit Sophia like ice water. Sightings. She hadn't heard that term in years, not since Luke disappeared. "Margaret," Sophia whispered. "You don't mean..." A loud thump echoed on the cabin roof. Both women jolted. Margaret grabbed Sophia's wrist, eyes wide with terror. "Don't look outside tonight," she whispered. "And whatever you hear, ignore it." Sophia tried to calm her rapid breathing. "Aunt Margaret, talk to me. What sightings?" Margaret swallowed hard, voice trembling. "People, shapes, children standing in the tree line, pale, watching." Sophia felt her stomach twist. Margaret continued, voice cracking. "2 nights ago, I saw Luke." Sophia gasped. "No, Aunt Margaret, that's impossible. He was standing right at the edge of the woods," she whispered, smiling, like he never left. Another heavy thump on the roof silenced them. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, walking across the cabin roof like someone dragging frozen feet. Margaret grabbed a lantern. "We need to go to the basement, now." But before she could move, a soft tapping echoed at the living room window. 3 gentle taps. Tap, tap, tap. A child's voice drifted through the glass, faint but unmistakable. Sophia opened the door. Sophia's blood ran cold. The voice, she would have known that voice anywhere. Luke, his voice pitch perfect, frozen in time, still 13. "Sophia, please. I'm cold." Tears blurred her vision. "Luke," she whispered. Margaret grabbed her shoulders violently. "That's not him," she hissed. "No matter what it sounds like, it's not him." The tapping grew louder, more insistent, the voice more desperate. "Sophia, I'm hurt. I need you." She covered her ears as her chest tightened. Margaret extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the dim glow of Christmas lights. The footsteps on the roof stopped. The tapping stopped. Silence fell so thick it buzzed in her ears. Then, from the back door, came another sound, knocking, calm, rhythmic, human, 3 knocks, followed by a whisper. "Let me in. It's Christmas." Margaret backed away, trembling violently. "It knows you're here," she whispered. "It always knows when someone with grief returns." Sophia's voice quivered. "Aunt Margaret, what are you talking about?" Her aunt wiped tears from her cheeks. "The forest spirit, the one the town used to warn us about. The one that mimics voices. It comes during the winter storms. It takes children first, and then the back door handle rattled suddenly. And then it comes for whoever it left behind," she finished shakily. Sophia shook her head. "No, spirits don't talk like people. They don't." The front door handle jiggled violently. The thing outside had moved, and it was no longer using Luke's voice. Now it whispered in a distorted echo of Sophia's own voice. "Let me in. It's cold. It's so cold." Margaret dragged her toward the basement door. "We have to hide now." They descended into the cold stone basement, locking the door behind them. Margaret lit a single candle, shielding the flame with shaking hands. The basement smelled like dust and old pine. Boxes were scattered everywhere, and among them Sophia recognized one she hadn't seen since childhood. Luke's box. His toys, his winter gloves, his Christmas stocking. She felt something pull her toward it, but Margaret stopped her. "Don't touch anything," she whispered. "It confuses the spirit. Your scent, your memories. Don't give it more to mimic." From upstairs came the creaking of floorboards. Something was moving through the cabin. Slow, careful, searching. A scraping noise drifted down the basement. Stairs as if long nails were dragging across wood. "It's looking for you," Margaret whispered. It always finishes what it started. Sophia felt tears stream down her face. Why did it take Luke? Margaret swallowed. Because it needed a voice. It needed a child's cry to lure others during every storm. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then a soft whisper came from directly behind them. Sophia. Sophia froze. Slowly, terrified, she turned. Her blood curdled. Standing at the far end of the basement was Luke, or something wearing his shape. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His clothes were the same winter jacket he wore the night he disappeared. Snow fell from his hair. His eyes were wrung too wide, too bright, too hollow. Sophia, he whispered, smiling too widely. You came back for me. Margaret screamed, don't look at it. But Sophia was frozen, horrified. Luke took a step forward, bare feet scraping the concrete. I waited for you, he whispered. So long. Margaret grabbed Sophia's arm and pulled her behind a shelf, blowing out the candle. Darkness swallowed them whole. They pressed against the wall, trembling. Luke's footsteps echoed softly, weaving through the basement. Where are you hiding? He whispered sweetly. We can be together now, forever. Something brushed the edge of the shelf, something colder than ice. Sophia bit down on her fist to stop herself from screaming. Then Margaret whispered into her ear, voice breaking, he's not real. He's dead, Sophia. That thing killed him long ago. The footsteps paused. Aunt Margaret, Luke's voice said from the darkness behind them. You should have come for me too. Margaret gasped. A hand shot out of the darkness, gripping her ankle with inhuman force. She screamed as she was yanked out from behind the shelf. No. Sophia lunged forward, grabbing her aunt's hands, pulling with every ounce of strength, but the creature was too strong. It dragged Margaret across the basement floor, scraping her nails against the stone. The thing wearing Luke's voice laughed high, childlike, wrong. It's Christmas, Aunt Margaret, it whispered. Time to come home. With a final jerk, Margaret was ripped from Sophia's grasp and dragged into the darkness. Her screams echoed, then stopped abruptly. Sophia collapsed, shaking violently, sobbing into her hands. She didn't know how long she lay there minutes, hours listening to the wind moan through the cabin. Eventually, silence returned. Sophia crawled back up the basement stairs, hands trembling uncontrollably. She unlocked the basement door and stepped into the cabin. It was empty, quiet. The front door stood open, snow drifting inside. Footprints small, child-sized led out into the forest. And beside them, dragged marks like something had been pulled. Sophia stumbled outside into the storm, calling for her aunt, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. She followed the footprints deep into the woods until they abruptly stopped at the edge of a frozen creek. Only one thing remained in the snow. A small object. Luke's glove, frozen stiff. Inside it, a single slip of folded paper. Sophia unfolded it with numb fingers. One word was written in a childish scrawl she recognized instantly. Come. The wind howled like laughter behind her. She turned and saw pale shapes standing between the trees. Children, dozens of them, silent, watching only their eyes moved, tracking her every breath. And in the front stood Luke, smiling faintly. It's your turn now, he whispered. The forest went dark. The Christmas lights along the rural highway flickered behind thick waves of falling snow as 32-year-old Emily Dawson gripped her steering wheel, praying her old Subaru would make it the final 9 miles to Red Pine Creek, an isolated mountain town in northern Idaho, where she grew up but never wanted to return to. Yet here she was, driving back on Christmas Eve after receiving a frantic call from her father earlier that afternoon. He had whispered into the phone, voice trembling, "Emily, they're back. The carolers. The ones from the year your mum went missing. Don't come outside tonight, whatever you do." And then the line went dead. Emily hadn't heard her father's voice like that since she was 10 years old, the night her mother disappeared during a brutal Christmas snowstorm, vanishing after opening the front door because someone was singing outside. The sheriff insisted her mother had simply taken off, overwhelmed by holiday stress, but Emily remembered seeing dark silhouettes outside the house. She remembered music, soft, harmonious Christmas melodies sung in voices too synchronized, too pitch perfect, too cold to be human. They called them the Midnight Carolers, a local legend dating back to the 1920s, when families claimed ghostly choirs wandered through blizzards, mimicking voices to lure people into the woods. Most residents dismissed it as folklore. Her father never did. Now, as Emily drove deeper into the valley, the snowstorm seemed to swallow the world around her. The trees bent under the weight of the storm, their shadows stretching across the road like reaching arms. Her headlights flickered. The radio sputtered, switching channels on its own, static. Then faint singing broke through, distant, layered, haunting. God rest the merry gentleman. Emily's breath hitched. She slammed the radio off and focused on the road. But the singing lingered in the wind outside, growing louder, closer, eerily harmonious. She pressed harder on the gas until her father's cabin emerged from the snow, lights glowing dimly behind frosted windows. She jumped out, dragging her suitcase through the drifts, heart pounding against her ribs. The door was unlocked. "Dad?" She called. No answer. The living room was dim, lit only by the glow of old Christmas bulbs strung unevenly along the ceiling. The house felt cold, far colder than it should have been with the heater running. Frost clung to the inside of the windows. Emily stepped farther, inside, and froze. Her father sat in his old rocking chair facing the front door, completely still. "Dad," she approached slowly. His eyes were wide open, staring, but unfocused. He was breathing shallow, slow, but he didn't react as she knelt beside him. "Dad, talk to me, please." His lips trembled. Then he whispered, barely audible, "There in the woods, waiting for you." Emily's stomach twisted. "Who?" His gaze shifted toward the frosted window. "The ones who took your mother." Emily's throat tightened. "Dad, that was 22 years ago. We don't know what happened." He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "They came back last night, singing. They called my name, your mother's voice among them. I didn't open the door." His hand shook violently. "Don't open the door tonight either." A distant harmony rose outside, soft, melodic, drifting through the storm. Emily snapped her head toward the window. The singing was unmistakable now. Multiple voices, close, too close. Her father trembled violently. "Go to the bedroom. Lock the door. Don't listen." But Emily couldn't move. She was paralyzed by a familiar fear, an old childhood terror she had buried deep. The Christmas lights inside the cabin flickered, humming faintly. The singing outside shifted into another song, Silent Night, beautiful, haunting. Wrong, her father whispered. They come for the grieving, for the lonely, for those who still listen. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door. Soft, 3 taps. Emily flinched. Her father squeezed her arm, shaking his head desperately. Another knock slightly louder. Then a voice drifted through the door. A woman's voice. Emily, honey, open up. Emily's heart cracked in two. The voice was her mother's, her exact voice. She backed away, eyes burning with tears. Mum, she whispered. Her father grabbed her shoulders. It's not her. They mimic. That's how they take you. But the voice continued, filled with gentle warmth. Emily, sweetheart, please. It's so cold. Let me in. Emily covered her mouth, sobbing. Her father turned his face away, tears streaming down his cheeks. Carolers can't come inside unless you open the door, he whispered. They need an invitation. The doorknob rattled violently. The singing outside swelled, more voices joining in deep baritones, soft sopranos, layers of perfect harmony weaving through the storm. Then Emily heard something that shattered her. A second voice. Hers, her own voice, echoing from outside the cabin. Dad, please open the door. Her father moaned, collapsing back into the rocker. They're stronger tonight, he whispered. They brought a storm with them. The windows began to fog over completely, frost spreading in thin patterns like veins. The shadow of a figure appeared outside a tall silhouette holding a lantern, swaying slightly, as if performing in a choir. More silhouettes joined it. Dozens, all standing perfectly still in formation. All waiting. Emily forced herself to drag her father into the bedroom and locked the door, barricading it with a dresser. The singing continued, vibrating the walls. Emily searched the room for anything that could help. She found an old journal on the nightstand, her father's handwriting inside. The entries were frantic, written over years. They come every few winters. They mimic to lure the grieving. Light weakens, them real fire, not electric. Don't listen. Don't open the door. Your mother opened it because she heard Emily crying outside. Emily felt her heart crack as she read the last line. They only take one at a time, but they always return for unfinished business. The singing grew louder, so loud the floorboards vibrated. Then, suddenly, silence. Too sudden, too precise. Emily froze. From the living room came her mother's voice, again soft, soothing, inches from the bedroom door. Emily, you're still my little girl. Let Mummy in. Emily pressed her back against the dresser, shaking uncontrollably. You're not her, she whispered. The voice outside the door shifted, dropping into a lower, distorted pitch. Then why do you want to believe I am? Emily squeezed her eyes shut as the bedroom window filled with silhouette stark figures, forming a perfect half-circle outside. Their faces pressed against the glass, pale and expressionless, mouths slightly open as if mid. Then the glass cracked. A thin line first, then another, a web spreading across it. Emily grabbed her father's lighter from the nightstand, the old Zippo he kept in memory of her mother, and flicked it open with trembling fingers. Her father stirred weakly, whispering, "Fire. They fear fire." The window shattered inward as freezing wind and snow burst into the room. The carolers stepped through silent, tall, dressed in old Victorian clothes, their faces smooth like porcelain masks. Their mouths opened in perfect unison, but instead of breath, a thick white mist poured out, creeping across the floor toward her. Emily lit the lighter and held it out, but the flame was too small, too weak. The carolers advanced, their footsteps soundless. One of them, a woman-shaped figure with long white hair and hollow eyes, stepped forward and tilted its head. When it spoke, it used Emily's mother's voice again. "Come, darling. It's Christmas Eve." Emily screamed and grabbed the curtains, ripping them down to expose the wood behind. She struck the lighter again and pressed the flame to the fabric. It caught slowly, then faster. Fire crawled upward, illuminating the room. The carolers recoiled, their porcelain faces cracking slightly, revealing shadow beneath. But they didn't leave, they surrounded the fire, circling like dancers, humming a low, eerie tune that shook Emily's bones. The flames grew larger, consuming the wall, the ceiling beginning to darken. Emily dragged her father toward the window. "We're jumping," she said, voice shaking. "Now?" He nodded faintly. She shoved him out first onto the snowbank below, then climbed out herself, just as the carolers reached toward her with elongated, frost-covered fingers. She landed hard beside her father, grabbed his arm, and pulled him toward the truck parked outside. But when she looked up, her blood froze. More carolers stood in a ring around the cabin, hundreds of them, silhouettes stretching deep into the forest. They stood perfectly still, lanterns glowing faintly in their hands, watching, waiting. The fire inside the cabin reflected off their hollow faces as they slowly turned their heads toward Emily. Their mouths opened in unison, and then they began to sing again. The most beautiful, haunting Christmas hymn Emily had ever heard. A song that felt like it could pull her soul out of her body. Her father collapsed into the snow, covering his ears, screaming. Emily dragged him to the truck, shoved him inside, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, choked, then roared to life. The carolers surged forward in perfect harmony, voices rising into a terrifying crescendo. Emily hit the gas, tires skidding over ice as she sped down the mountain road. The singing chased them, never growing faint, never falling behind. It followed them for miles. Only when they reached the highway did it finally fade. They drove straight to the next town, where Emily called the sheriff. The cabin was burned to the ground by the time authorities arrived. No footprints in the snow, no bodies, no sign of anyone living or dead, but neighbors swore they heard singing in the forest that night, soft, harmonious. The first thing Emma noticed that night was how unnaturally still the snow looked, as if the entire world had taken a breath and frozen midway through inhaling. And in the silence that pressed on her ears, she felt a familiar but unwelcome sensation, the feeling of being watched. She had driven 6 hours through a twisting stretch of northern Minnesota, heading toward her family's old winter cabin on Windermere Lake. A place she had avoided for nearly 20 years because of what happened the last time she was here. But the cabin was the only place she could retreat to after her recent divorce, the only place untouched by the messy unraveling of her life. And her therapist had suggested that revisiting childhood places could help her face the memories she kept trying to smother. When she reached the frozen lake, the sky was already darkening. Christmas lights twinkling from distant cabins farther along the shoreline, and the heavy scent of pine and cold wind wrapped around her as though welcoming her back. But something felt wrong the moment she stepped out of her car. It was too quiet for a holiday week. No distant laughter from neighboring cabins, no snowmobiles, no dogs, not even the usual moaning of wind slithering through the trees. She remembered flashes of her last trip here at age 12, her older brother, Luke, claiming he saw a man in red walking alone on the ice late at night. A man who didn't leave footprints and kept knocking on the cabin's windows in the storm. Their parents had brushed it off as a child's imagination. But both Emma and Luke were never the same after that winter, especially after Luke went missing on the final night, disappearing into the blizzard without a trace, with the only clue being the smeared outline of a gloved handprint on the back window. Now, as Emma approached the porch with the key she hadn't used in decades, she felt her throat tighten. The front door, a deep rustic red, looked freshly painted, though she knew nobody had been here since her parents sold the place a decade ago. The paint shimmered faintly, almost wet-looking, and when she touched it, the surface felt strangely warm, as if someone had been inside, heating the cabin only moments before she arrived. She pushed the door open, and the interior looked exactly as she remembered. Stone fireplace, wooden shelves stacked with old family ornaments, a dried wreath still hanging crookedly above the mantel. She turned on the lights, but they flickered weakly, humming in a low, trembling rhythm as though struggling against something unseen. She began to unpack, trying to ignore the crawling sensation at the back of her neck. She had come here for quiet, to write the last of her clients' holiday reports before closing the year. Maybe drink cocoa in silence and gather herself before the new year. Nothing more, but the cabin seemed unwilling to offer peace. Throughout the first evening, Emma kept hearing small noises, soft crunches in the snow just outside, faint tapping on the side walls, and just once the unmistakable sound of footsteps slowly circling the cabin. She pressed her back against the window and peered outside, but her breath fogged the glass too quickly for her to see far. The lake looked endless and empty. The following morning, she walked down to the frozen shoreline, hoping to shake the unease from her mind. But halfway across the lake she noticed something wrong. A bright red cabin in the distance that she did not remember ever being there. It sat on the opposite side of the lake, small and perfectly square, its color too vibrant compared to the bleak winter landscape. Its windows were blacked out, like eyes refusing to reflect the world. What unsettled her most was the fact that the snow surrounding it was untouched. No paths, no tracks, not even signs of wind disturbance. As she stared at the cabin, she felt a sharp sting of déjà vu. A memory of her brother pointing at something across the lake and whispering, "He lives there. The man in red lives there." But she had always assumed he'd been pointing at a snowdrift or a shadow. She returned to her cabin quickly, her heart pounding with an old fear she had buried deep. That afternoon, snow began to fall heavily, the flakes thick and glistening like shards of glass, and by evening the storm was raging, slamming into the windows with a force that felt intentional. Emma wrapped herself in a blanket, lit the fireplace, and tried to read. But the flames sputtered oddly, forming shapes small silhouette, almost human in outline. Around midnight, a knock sounded at the door. A single knock, slow, deliberate. She froze. Another knock came, louder this time, followed by a dragging sound along the wooden boards of the porch. Emma stepped toward the door, heart hammering, but didn't dare touch the handle. The dragging moved from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. Silence. When she finally looked through the peephole, there was nothing, just swirling snow. She backed away. Then the back window shattered. She screamed and grabbed the nearest heavy objective fireplace poker and rushed into the kitchen, where cold air poured in through the broken glass. Snowflakes littered the floor like spilled teeth. Outside, she heard footsteps crunching away into the trees. She called the police, but reception flickered uselessly. The operator's voice warped, cut out, then returned in a whisper that chilled her. "Don't open the door for him." The call dropped. She barricaded the windows with furniture, trembling uncontrollably. That night, she didn't sleep. At dawn, she ventured out to inspect the damage, and that's when she saw them. Footprints large, boot-shaped, but distorted, leading away from the cabin toward the lake. The prints didn't sink normally. The edges were crisp, as if something heavy and weightless at the same time had stepped there. Against her better judgment, driven by a mix of fear, curiosity, and the unbearable loneliness of the place, she followed the trail. The footprints led halfway across the lake before abruptly veering toward the distant red cabin. As she approached it, the air grew colder, so cold her eyelashes froze together. The door of the cabin stood slightly open, and from inside came a faint glow, like candlelight. She pushed the door and stepped inside, her breath catching. The interior was an exact mirror of her own family's cabin, same furniture, same decorations, same fireplace, but everything was tinted red, as if dipped in diluted blood. On the mantel sat framed photographs, her family, Christmas 2004, the year Luke vanished. She staggered backward. The next photo showed her standing at the lake earlier that morning, taken from behind. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure reflected in the picture, tall, thin, wearing a red coat and snow-covered boots. Her head swam as a deep voice whispered from the dark corner behind her, "You came back, just like he did." She spun around, but the figure stepped into the dim candlelight, only partially enough to see the outline of a long coat, enough to see the glint of something metallic in one hand. Emma stumbled out of the cabin and ran blindly into the storm, the snow cutting into her face like needles. She could hear him behind her, steady, calm, dragging something heavy through the snow as he followed her across the ice. She reached her cabin breathless, slamming the door shut. The storm roared outside as she pressed her back to the door, tears freezing on her cheeks. For hours the footsteps circled the cabin, never rushing, never faltering, simply waiting. When morning finally came, she found a small object left on the porch, her brother's old compass, the one he'd carried the night he disappeared. A message was carved into the wood beneath it. "He followed me. Now he follows you." Emma collapsed, shaking violently. She packed her things in frantic movements, threw them into her car, and sped down the snowy path without looking back. When she reached the main road hours later and glanced in her rearview mirror, she gasped. Bright red figure stood on the frozen lake, motionless, watching her fade into the distance. She drove straight to the nearest town police station and reported everything. But when officers accompanied her back to Wintermere Lake the next day, both cabins were gone, vanished without a trace. No broken window, no footprints, no red cabin, no photographs, just untouched, endless snow. The officers told her she was exhausted, perhaps hallucinating from stress, perhaps misremembering childhood trauma. But that night, as Emma checked into a roadside lodge and tried to calm her nerves, she saw a smear of red paint on her doorframe, fresh, wet. And sometime after midnight, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, someone gently knocked on her door. Once, twice. Then the dragging sound began again.